I have to sometimes slow down and breathe and be like, you published 2 books. You did that. So there's always that, even though it's never enough.
Welcome to Queries, Qualms, and Quirks, the weekly podcast that asks published authors to share their successful query letter and discuss their journey from first spark to day of publication. I am your host, author Sarah Nicolas, and literary agent Sarah N. Fisk. Derek Milman is the author of the YA novels Swipe Right for Murder and Scream All Night. A classically trained actor who worked for years in TV and film, Derek now lives in Brooklyn, where he tries to write full-time. So please welcome Derek to the show. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, good. Thanks so much for coming on and talking to my listeners today.
My pleasure.
We are going to talk about your journey to publication. And so we're going to start all the way back at the beginning. When did you first start getting interested in writing? And then how long did it take before you started getting serious about pursuing publication?
Yeah, it was definitely in like several stages, I think. The first thing that happened was that I was like auditioning a lot for like a lot of A-list projects and coming very, very close. And I started to have like, I started to feel this sort of creative fatigue, and I wanted to sort of step back and take control of my like creative endeavors. And I had started out as a playwright, but I wasn't a good playwright. I was sort of writing in the wrong medium. And then when I went to grad school for acting, I went to Yale Drama, which is, famous for its grind. I really stopped writing for many years. So I was like actually in Montreal for like my brother's bachelor party. And I was going to be his best man at his wedding. And I was working on his speech in a cafe in Montreal, which is a very dreamy city. I don't know if you've ever been there.
Mm-mm.
Makes sense that a lot of like video game studios are there. I was like, oh yeah, I get that. And I was taking notes, and then I was like, you know what? YA was sort of reaching this apex where it was sort of permeating pop culture, and it was certainly permeating Hollywood and what I was doing in the entertainment industry. Hunger Games was popping. This is maybe around 2012, 2013. Jennifer Lawrence had just signed on to do the first movie. So it was really sort of hitting everyone. And I was like, I feel like because I had read a lot of like, I guess what could be considered like early YA books before YA was a thing, like J.D. Salinger. I had read a lot of those books like when I was like a small kid. And then I wound up doing like a stage production of Salinger's Franny and Zoe when I was in college at Northwestern. I sort of like internalized a lot of his language. And I feel like since he was sort of one of the first writers that created the whole concept of voice, I felt like I could nail voice. So I started taking notes in this cafe. I was like, I just like pushed myself. I'm like, come on, Derek, you can like come up with some cool idea. Mm-hmm. And I took some like very vague notes about a kid who was sort of waking up, having written strange symbols in his sleep, and he didn't know what was going on, and it was sort of linked to this parallel world, and there was a brother, and there was all this stuff, and then I forgot about it. Honestly, it was in a journal, it was in a notebook, and I many months later, and this is after my brother's wedding and all that, maybe 6 months later, actually, I was in Los Angeles. I was subletting a place in West LA, and there was a lot of downtime between auditions, and I don't think I even had a laptop with me. I'm just like a famously light packer. And I think I just I like to write by hand. And I had the notebook with me that I had taken to Montreal, and I just happened to read over these old notes I had taken, and I hadn't seen them in months. I was like, oh my God, there's something here. So I spent maybe the next week or so, writing an outline for a YA book that was first called Dreamcrawler, and then later became titled The Gray Light Chronicles, and then later we called it The Neon Veil. But I was writing the bare bones outline of this book while I was in Los Angeles in between auditions, when I was just very frustrated, and it was just a lot of loneliness too. I think I find LA a very lonely place. Everything's very isolated, especially if you're there visiting by yourself or you're there on work. So I wrote all these notes, and then I didn't forget about it this time. When I got home, I think it was in spring of 2013, maybe, I was really jazzed. I'm like, I think that I have something here. And then 5 months later, I wrote a first draft, and it was done. I think it was maybe I don't remember word count. It was I had maybe 300 pages of text. And I started circulating it to family and friends, and people were like, wow, this is really good. And I'm like, okay, and people, even like cousins and stuff are like, this is some of the best stuff I've ever read. I'm like, all right, calm down. I don't know what's going to happen. Let's see, So I really had no idea what I was doing, as probably many writers do. It was like just the period before everything was moving to Twitter and all those pitch contests were starting. I didn't know if they had started by then. I didn't know about DV Pit and Pitch Wars and stuff. They may have already started, but they weren't reaching me. I wasn't really active on Twitter yet. So that's how I wrote the first YA book that I wrote that's how it came to be.
So when you decided you wanted to be a published author, what did you kind of think that was going to look like for you?
I didn't really know what the other side of it looked like. In my old neighborhood, there was a Barnes & Noble, and I'd go there and I'd look at all the books that were in the young adult section just to get a sense of what was selling and what was being published at the time. And I was like, maybe one day I could be here. Although there's a lot of fantasy and there's a lot of, it was the period of time where like everyone on the cover looked like Jennifer Lawrence, like wearing some sort of cloak in a storm, looking fierce. I'm like,
it was the white girl in a dress cover era.
It was that era. Exactly. Yeah. I was like, I wonder. So I wasn't sure what it was going to look like for me. I felt like if I was able to do it and get published, I would probably be doing something that was maybe a bit unique. And I was right. It was unique. It turned out to be maybe the first book anyway, turned out to be a little bit too unique and ambitious. But I felt that was pretty much my primary answer to your question, is that I felt like whatever it was, I was going to be on a different kind of path than what was, I think, typically marketed, or what was the commercial end of things.
So once you decided you wanted to be a published author, how did you learn more about the publishing industry, like how to query, how it works, everything like that?
I think I looked at Query Tracker and like Publishers Marketplace, and you could do it in a few hours and get a pretty good sense of the agencies out there, the good agencies out there. As my friend in my debut group later told me, she's like, yeah, there's tons of agents, but doesn't it seem like 20 people have everyone? And it's kind of true in a way. Like there's like hundreds of agents. Yeah, you have a lot of options, but like 20 people have everyone. So I wasn't really active on Twitter yet, but I started to realize that I needed to be. So I started like looking at agents on Twitter, and then I started query. I think I worked as hard as I could on getting the manuscript, in my eyes, as polished as I could. And then I started querying. And what happened in that first round was pretty much nothing. I got rejections all over the place. As any writer will tell you, just tons and tons of rejections. Nothing special, no feedback, nothing. But then what happened is I'm like, I've been in the industry, like, why am I doing it this way? So I gave the manuscript to a friend of mine who's a movie producer, and she's still very active in the industry. She just passed the manuscript along to two publishers. I think one was at St. Martin's Press and one was at HarperCollins. The editor or the publisher at St. Martin's wasn't into it, but the editor at HarperCollins really thought there was something there. And she sort of took me under her wing, and we started emailing back and forth. And this is something that really doesn't happen. And she said, I want you to rewrite this, and here's what I want you to do with it. And I think that this could be something because your voice is very unique, which is something that I was thinking I had, that this, whatever was going to happen with me and my path, I probably had a voice that was its own thing. As soon as that happened, and I was working on this manuscript with her, I requeried all the agents that had passed on me and had rejected me, and every single one of them, some of them wrote back in like 15 minutes. We're like, oh my, because I said, I have a publisher that's interested, HarperCollins, and I'm working with them and revising, but I feel like I need an agent with the same pages that were in the original query. We're like, this is great. I love the pages you've included. Send me the full manuscript. Most people ask, just send me the full manuscript. A few were like, no, send me the first 50 pages. I never understood the partial thing. It's what if that's their thing? Okay, it's just very strange to me. Just read the first 50 pages. Why do I have to break it up? Read what you want. It just seems so strange to me.
I feel like that was probably a holdout from when everything was done with paper.
Yeah, it probably is. And they should let it go. Or maybe they have. I don't know. Although I do know people who are querying and it's still happening, where if there's interest, most of them just ask for the full manuscript. So I sent a lot of full manuscripts out, and I got more rejections. I got a lot of rejections. And then I had a lot of personal stuff happen to me. I had a close friend die very suddenly. We had to move out of the apartment we had been living in for 11 years because it was sort of going co-op, and it was just time to get out. So we moved to Brooklyn when I was in a very sort of fragile state, and I was still getting rejections. And once we moved to Brooklyn, like everything changed. Moving from the Upper West Side to Williamsburg, Brooklyn was like the equivalent of moving to a different city and state. It was totally different. Everything was different. It was in a phase, this specific area of having a dreaminess to it. And that immediately affected my writing and everything that I was doing creatively. What wound up happening, I'm trying to remember this now, is that one agent was very interested, started to get very interested. But he wanted to work with me, and he wound up like taking me out to very fancy lunches and very fancy places and was sort of wining and dining me. But the version that he wanted of this book was just something I felt like I wanted an agent, and I really wanted to make this happen. But I just like the version that he wanted was so different from what I felt like I could write. So I was almost on the cusp of just turning him down when my current agent, Victoria Marini, said, "You know what? I love this. I don't think it's quite ready to go out yet, but I have a few thoughts. Why don't we meet for coffee?" And that's an advantage of being in New York, because I was already meeting with this other agent, and I was able to meet her in person. We had coffee in my neighborhood. Like, she got on a train to meet me. She also lives in Brooklyn, but a different part of Brooklyn. And we met for coffee, and we chatted, and she talked to me about the manuscript and what her vision for it was. And I felt like I could match it. She said it had a very like Clockwork Orange vibe. I just liked the things that she was saying. It made me realize that she had sort of gotten it in a deeper way, and she sort of understood what I wanted to do with it. Did I answer your question? Am I over talking?
Yeah, you're going into the next question, but that's fine. I was just going to let you keep
going. Ask the next question.
No, so the next question is basically, after you did your research, what happened between then and signing your first book contract? So I feel like you're part of the way there. You can just keep on going.
A few weeks later, I think we agreed that we could work together, and she sort of announced on Twitter. I think I had maybe like 200 followers at the time, maybe even less. I was now repped, and it was like a big day for me. I think that was like 2015. So it was only a few weeks after I had moved to Brooklyn. And then she had notes, so I wound up working on the manuscript with her notes. And then I wound up going to Paris to visit a friend with my partner, and we were sort of bumming around Paris. And she timed everything perfectly, which she always does. So on my flight home, I got like the major notes from her about about the revisions and where she wanted me to take this. So I basically read what this book was going to become, like on the flight back from Paris to New York City. And I guess this was summer of 2015. So we must have gone out with it that fall, I think, because she wanted to time it to go out in the fall. What wound up happening is actually exciting and heartbreaking at the same time. That editor who had taken me under her wing loved it so much, what I did with it, and she wanted to buy it. But when it got to sales and acquisitions, it got shut down because they felt like it was too ambitious. They thought that it was too different, it was too unique, it was straddling too many genres, because it was sort of a horror sci-fi fantasy. Same thing happened at Razorbill. An editor at Razorbill also tried to buy it, and the same thing happened. It got shut down at sales and marketing, or the acquisitions, I should say. Sales and marketing didn't necessarily know where it would go on a shelf in a bookstore, like what genre it would be. It's funny because Stranger Things came along like a year or so later and did exactly what I was doing. Except my book wasn't set in the 80s, but it merged horror and sci-fi. And it was almost like exactly what I was doing, that I could have reverse pitched it as Stranger Things if Stranger Things had existed. The thing is, I was writing the next book at the time. Mm-hmm. I was already writing the next book. So it was heartbreaking that this book wasn't going to sell. And maybe one day it will. I don't know what's going to happen with it. Some people are still like, it's the best thing you ever wrote, Derek. Like, thanks for that. But I was already writing Scream All Night, and Scream All Night is very much influenced in like my first year or two of living in Brooklyn. And a lot of places in the book are sort of modeled on places that existed in the neighborhood that most don't exist anymore, because this neighborhood has a lot of turnover. But the dreaminess that I was experiencing influenced Scream All Night, as well as my time on movie sets, my interest in horror. And I did a sort of method actor approach to writing it, where I sort of just subsumed myself in the world of B horror movies. We wound up getting a double offer from HarperCollins, where the editor who took me under her wing offered, and then another imprint, which was Balzer and Bray, offered. I actually wound up going with Balzer and Bray because I thought they'd be a better fit for the book editorially. And the vision of that editor was more aligned with what I felt. The book was announced like right before the 2016 election, and then it came out in 2018 to a very changed world. And that was my debut.
All right. It's time for the first cue of the podcast. Can you read your successful query letter for us?
Dear Victoria, I hope this email finds you well. Happily, I'm in a unique and lucky position as a debut novelist. Some colleagues circulated my manuscript and got it to HarperCollins. HC responded enthusiastically and gave me a lot of notes. I found their feedback intriguing and incisive, and I spent the last 6 months revising along their guidelines. It was a successful process, and I just sent them the revised MS last week. The project has attracted the interest of a few agents. One has taken me out to lunch twice now to discuss the direction of the project. We aren't sure yet if our vision for the project is a match. HarperCollins made it clear they have a short list of agents they will recommend, but before things go any faster, I wanted to reach out to a few agents who are on my own list. The story concerns 15-year-old former lacrosse star Brady Baylock. His chance at being high school golden boy was shattered once his father, a notable astrophysicist, disappeared. Brady's gone off his antidepressants and is experiencing an escalating series of bizarre and terrifying phenomena. Besides having the state of his sanity thrown into question, these events are causing tension with his best friend, wreaking havoc with his grades, and hindering his budding romance with a mysterious girl at school. Brady realizes he has a genetic anomaly that not only allows him to decrypt the fabric of space and time, but pass through it. On the other side of the fabric, Brady finds a fractured, irradiated version of his New England town called the Quintessence. That's as psychedelic and seductive as it is dangerous and broken, a cosmological mistake that was never meant to be. Searching for his father and desperate to save his deeply depressed mother, Brady learns the only ones who can help him are a feral gang of thieves who manipulate their consciousness to commit horrific crimes. Brady travels back and forth from the Quintessence, and the two realities begin to bleed. Brady is not only at risk from radiation, but of getting a lifelong residency at his town's forbidding psych ward, colloquially known as the Longhampton Home for Lunatic Teens. As Brady decides just how far he's willing to go to put the pieces of his old life back together, he discovers his father wasn't who he thought he was, and he has a brother who wants a piece of Brady's life all to himself. The Grey Lake Chronicles is a YA fantasy. It's 92,000 words. It's been compared to The Raven Boys and Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I am querying you because you're attracted to the dark and edgy, you value strong voices, you appreciate humor, and you don't shy away from horror. I studied English, creative writing, and theater at Northwestern University. I began my career as a playwright, but was accepted into the MFA program of the Yale School of Drama as an actor. When I'm not writing, I continue to act in TV and film. I've included the first 2 chapters below. Thank you for your consideration. Very best wishes, Derek Milman.
Yeah, I can definitely see some Stranger Things tie-ins.
Yeah.
And the Clockwork Orange. So that's interesting. For anyone who processes that kind of information better, you can find the text of the query linked in the show notes. But I did want to point out one thing because I think your story and the query, there's an interesting twist on this because you will hear some people say that you can't get agent attention, you can't get editor attention unless you already know someone. And you did know someone, and it did get you agent and editor attention, but it still didn't sell the book.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's true. Not the first one. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's just really interesting because people think, oh, if you know someone, you have an in and you're golden, but then obviously, that's not necessarily true.
Connections can always help. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to help you hit that home run. And this was going to probably be like a duology or trilogy, and they knew that they would probably it was going to be a big advance. And so they were extra skittish about something that was maybe not along the lines of what was typical at the time. And that even includes having a male protagonist, which is still not as common as you'd think.
Yeah. So what has your experience been like since signing that first book contract, especially were there any surprises along the way?
Yeah, I mean, it's all full of surprises. What surprised me most about the my experience at HarperCollins is that people could really just not care about a book that they've acquired. And I fell through every crack that you could possibly fall through due to many different factors. One of the factors is that I lost my editor, and then I lost a second editor, and then I lost a third editor, and I lost a publicist, and they were restructuring.
What are you doing to them?
I swear I'm the easiest person to work with. I think they were just young and they were just kind of moving off to different jobs. It happens a lot in publishing, but if it happens to you, you can get really screwed. And that's unfortunately what happened. And I was just like, I would wake up to very, very, very angry emails from my agent about her experience trying to get HarperCollins to give us any kind of marketing. And I just didn't realize this could happen. It was kind of it was a massive letdown on many factors, many areas. That I was like, it was very disillusioning, and unfortunately, lots of people have had that experience, not only with HarperCollins, but with other publishers as well. So when they didn't want my second book, this was Swipe Right for Murder, which at the time was called Night Flight. At the time, I just told my agent, let's bail. So she submitted it around, and Jimmy Patterson, James Patterson's YA imprint at Little Brown, acquired it. And I had a great experience with them. So great that it made me angry in retrospect, realizing all the things that HarperCollins could have done that didn't do for Scream Online. And I should also say, and I didn't mention this, but 6 months before the book's release, there was a Hollywood bidding war for the rights. So I was dealing with producers and famous people who were trying to make it into a television show. And this actually wound up being a trip to Hollywood and a Universal backlot. Sean Hayes acquired it with UTV, and they were going to make it into this big TV show. And they got the showrunner, and it was all set to go. And then they couldn't sell it, just like my first book. I think Netflix turned it down, and like a couple of the big ones turned it down, but some of them just had very specific mandates where like, we can't do something with a protagonist this young. Apple, for instance, wanted to see a pilot first. They really liked it, but they didn't want to write the pilot. They wanted to get paid first. So then while we were in the middle of all of this, the showrunner jumped ship to take a paying gig because he has children or whatever. And that was it. The rights got reverted back to me. But I had a great agent at ICM and at the time, she's not there anymore. And I'm with a different film agent. And we're trying to get Swipe option. But so it was like what HarperCollins was doing and what Hollywood was doing. And I was just seeing like two different, like wildly different reactions. And it was just very strange. But I write very visually, so it didn't entirely surprise me. But I was like, oh, this could be a TV show. I see. So there's all this great hope of what the first book was going to be. I have since had the rights reverted back to me. So HarperCollins no longer owns Scream All Night. I do. I do not know what's going to happen, if it'll ever get republished again, rehomed. I hope so. If I have a third or fourth book that's very, very successful, that could happen. But I just wanted to, my agent wanted to get the rights back to me. So second experience at Little Brown was great. I went on a book tour. They did everything they could for me. They had a big fancy party with James Patterson. I did a signing at Book Expo. I went to Y'all Fest. I went to Louisiana Book Festival. I went all over the town. I went to the Pasadena YA Festival. I was basically in airports for that whole year, right before COVID. And they paid for everything. They paid for my flights and they paid for hotels. and even like if I ever took an Uber, they would pay for it. So that's how, but as people pointed out, that's also not typical. So I had two atypical experiences at the opposite ends of the spectrum. I think it's important to point that out. And so, as a result, Swipe Right for Murder earned out pretty quickly and sold a lot of copies because they put the muscle in. And it's an edgy book for YA. And I really, really love what it is. I loved being in that world, and I miss it in a way. Sometimes you go back and you're like, God, I miss writing that because you're submerged in that world. My tour for Swipe Right for Murder ended like 45 minutes before the pandemic. I got to the last hotel in Chicago to do an event as like South by Southwest announced that they were going to And that's, I think, where culturally we all realize that this is going to be a big thing. And that's when I got to the hotel, and I'm like a germaphobe. So I was like, oh my God, this is like the worst timing. And then when I got to New York, I had maybe a week or so before New York shut down. And then during the pandemic, my editor left, and then Jimmy Patterson got shut down. So there's no more. So I don't have an imprint anymore. So I don't have a publisher at the moment.
It is time for the quick round. I call it author DNA, just classifications we like to put writers in. Are you a pantser or a plotter?
I'm somewhere in between.
Do you tend to be an overwriter or an underwriter?
Overwriter.
Do you prefer to write in the morning or at night?
Afternoon.
When you start a new project, do you typically start with character or plot or concept or something else first?
Depends on the book. Usually character.
Do you prefer coffee or tea?
Coffee in the morning, tea at night.
When you're writing, do you prefer silence or some kind of sound?
I like to have electronica music, atmospheric music.
When it comes to writing the first draft, are you more of a get it down kind of person or a get it right kind of person?
Get it right.
What tools or software do you use to draft?
I use MS Word. I take notes on my one writing quirk. I use what's called a Postal Co notebook, which is made by a Japanese company. I like to write in these notebooks. I take notes by hand in those, and then I use MS Word to draft. Do
you prefer drafting or revising more?
I love revising.
Do you write in sequential order or do you hop around?
Oh my God, sequential order. Can you imagine?
And final quick round question. Are you an extrovert or an introvert?
Also depends on the circumstances. I think I'm classified as an INFJ. So I would say I'm an introvert with extroverted tendencies depending on the circumstances.
So now we're going to talk about the second Q of the show. What were some of the qualms or worries that you had on your journey, and were they realized? Did you overcome them? How did that shake out?
There's always the question, like, am I a good enough writer? There's so much out there. And seeing the numbers, like when agents post their numbers on Twitter, or like how many queries they got, and like, geez, this is rough. There's they get so many. So I guess I overcame a lot of that just by sticking true to my voice and my own vision, so that I was able to get published. And while the first experience was a letdown, the second one was better, and I hope to continue having better publishing, especially YA publishing, or just publishing in general, is something that there's just really no way to predict anything. You have to learn as you go. And there's just things that I don't even know yet. You learn. That's why our debut group was so necessary, because people just were asking questions, and like no one really knows anything. It's like you don't really learn a lot until you do it, even down to like mundane things. Like we had an ARC tour where we would send around our ARCs, which are advanced reader copies. And I only found out later that if you're sending books by mail, which you do in giveaways, you can just tell them you want the media mail rate, which is like $3. I was spending so much. I didn't even, little things like that. I just had no idea. I never sent books by mail before. How would I know? So yeah, a lot of things about like, am I good enough? Can I break through the market? Yeah, I think I overcame a lot of that, because I just like, I have to sometimes slow down and breathe and be like, you published 2 books, you did that. So there's always that, even though it's never enough. It's never enough. Hollywood's the same way. Being an actor is the same way. There's always that next thing you have to do. You can be a movie star, but you never won an Oscar. You have to win the Oscar, then you have to do this, then you have to get the franchise. It's never enough.
Yeah, I can see how acting is similar in that way. And I think I've had a couple of former stand-up comics on the podcast who turned into writers, and they've talked about that too, like the similarities between like facing the rejection. And
stand-up comedy is a famously brutal industry. I think it's maybe one of the worst. It's one of the most brutal. I have a friend who's a stand-up comic too, and I hear the stories, and you're probably right. There probably are a lot of similarities there, for sure.
All right, and you already referenced the third Q, but do you have any writing quirks? Is there anything about your writing process that you think is kind of different or interesting, unique?
One thing I would say, I mentioned the Postal Co notebooks that I favor. It's just kind of pretentious, honestly. I'm just making fun of myself with that. One thing is that I merged like a lot of things that I learned with my acting into my writing. So as an actor, and especially being classically trained, I learned a lot about the importance of conflict, psychological profiling, the importance of high stakes and scenes. And I was able to sort of just move that stuff over to a different adjacent art form. But something I did is, the method gets talked about and misunderstood a lot in the acting profession. But I did something along those lines with writing the first 2 books where I submerged myself in the world of it, and that helps. So, for instance, when I was writing Scream All Night, which is set in Moldavia's Castle, which is a fictional B horror movie studio, I wasn't just drafting the book, but I was watching all the Hammer horror movies at night. I was reading so many books about old, horror movies and studios like Troma Films and Hammer Films, so that all the sort of world of it was constantly around me. And similarly with Swipe Right for Murder, which is sort of a 21st century digital queer take on Hitchcock and North by Northwest, I would constantly play those movies, particularly North by Northwest, just to have in the background so I could just hear the rhythm of the dialogue and the banter and stuff. I've heard that filmmakers do this. Paul Thomas Anderson, when he was making There Will Be Blood, of course, now I can't remember the movie, but there was one movie, a classic movie, that was so influential for him in this movie that he constantly had it playing because he could learn every nuance about it. So that's probably my biggest quirk, is that I like to sort of submerge myself totally in the process and the world of the book.
Cool. When you were in the lowest parts of your writing journey, what kept you going and why did you stick to it?
I think my love of creating something, and just when you're at your lowest, it's usually like the commerce end of things. It's usually the business of publishing. If you just stay true, or if I just stayed true to what I was working on and just was like, I know I can do this, and just went back to the work itself and not necessarily paid attention to what was happening externally around me, things that I couldn't control, and focus on what I could control, which was the quality of the work and my writing, I was better off just letting go of things that I couldn't control.
Yeah, that's good. What are some of the mistakes that you felt like you made along the way that you might like to warn aspiring authors about so that they don't make the same ones?
I would say that just because an imprint wants to publish your book doesn't mean you should let that imprint publish your book. Your debut is really important. And if you're not going to have the experience, it shouldn't just be about getting published, honestly. If a debut goes sideways, you can spend a long time. I was lucky because I had a second book come out that sold better than the first book. But I did learn that if a debut goes sideways, it could take a long time to recover from that. So you want to make sure that this is the right book and this is the right publisher for it. And that this thing that you've struggled over is maybe not your debut. And maybe your debut should be a different book. And this book that you've struggled over should come later in a different form. So that's one thing I would say to do. And I would just be up on the industry and research everything, because it's constantly changing in terms of like what's being done, like what the etiquette is. So I would be up on that, as well as very much understand what books are selling, what books are popular within the last 3 years. Like, because people are still querying and talking about that they're going to write the next, Divergent or something, but that's considered ancient history in publishing. So you have to really, really, really come up with something. You have to show that you're at least cognizant of what the industry is doing right now, what the publishing world is doing right now within your genre. And you have to understand very, very, very specifically what your genre is, and where it would go on a bookstore shelf or a library.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you have to sort of have some sort of understanding of not just writing and of your own work, but of how your work would be marketed and sold, and just remain as the least amount of ignorant about that, I would say, be as knowledgeable as possible.
Can you share with listeners one of the most important lessons that you learned on your journey to publication?
Don't burn any bridges. Publishing has a long memory. Make sure you behave yourself, and you can always not say it or not tweet it. Not something that's happened to me, but things that I've seen happen. So you have to be careful.
I kind of call this the acknowledgments portion of the podcast. This is not a business that most of us succeed in completely on our own. So who are some of the people who helped you along the way, and how?
My family, my mom, my dad, my brother, a huge amount of emotional support. And my partner, Brian, who reads everything. And is so supportive because we live together. So he's able to tell me what's working and what isn't. He's probably the first person that reads anything I write. And of course, my agent, Victoria, she's just a good friend. And she's just really passionate about what she does. And she's a great protector of me and my writing.
Mm. Nice. Can you give us a little kind of sneak peek of what you're working on now, what we might be able to expect from you in the future?
Yes. The next project I'm working on that you might hear announced soon, or it might be something else, is it's actually a piece of queer dark academia. It's called With Love and Mischief, and it's about a dark gay romance set against a secret society at a New England prep school. It's based on a very real one at Yale, and I have all their notes and stuff. And I learned all about it. And there's a kidnapping involved, and it turned out to be this very sort of beautiful neo-Gothic story, and I'm a little obsessed with it. I also worked on this project, which we were trying to sell on proposal, called Johnny and the Jewels, which is basically like Adventures in Babysitting meets Uncut Gems, but queer. It's so punk and like whacked out. I'm not sure it's going to sell because it has this madcap quality. I'm just not sure what's going to happen with it, but it turned out to be so funny to me. So I hope something happens. I know people would love it. So few have seen it. And I feel like editors so far are like, I don't know what this is. So I'm not sure. The one thing that may be the most successful is my transition into adult. And I'm working on a Gothic retelling of Frankenstein, a modern retelling of Frankenstein, but it's queer. And like all my things lately, it's very loose. It's a very loose retelling. So it's not like a plot scene by scene. And it pays homage to a lot of other horror classics as well. That's going pretty well. So those are three things right there. I've been pretty busy. I just haven't been able to announce anything yet.
Yeah. All right, Derek, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your story with my listeners.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Queries, Qualms, and Quirks. You can find the text of Derek's query in the show notes, along with links to find out more about him and his books. If you enjoyed the show, I'd really appreciate if you help me find new listeners by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Podchaser, or Spotify, telling your friends, or sharing this episode on social media. If you're interested in supporting the show, go to patreon.com/pubtalklive. And if you're a published author interested in being a guest on the show, please click on the home base link in the description, or go to sarahnicolas.com and click on the podcast logo in the sidebar. That's Sarah with an H and Nicolas with an OH. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.